Hello, and welcome to our Lutheran theology course. In this first module, we're going to learn about Luther's theology of creation and practice the fun of being a theologian by thinking and imagining about God. For centuries, theologians have entertained the question of both how and why God created. As to the how of creation, the traditional Christian answer to which Luther also subscribed is that God created out of nothing. God produces matter without using anything of her own self nor any pre-existing material. Stepping out of her spirit, God opens a space outside of her being for something completely different than herself. A different view is that God created out of some pre-existing material, from a substance distinct from God, but like God it already existed, even if only in the form of some chaotic, disorganized matter, incapable of sustaining living creatures on its own. The third main answer has been that God created out of her own being. According to this view, if God is everything, there is no nothingness out of which to create. Christians have privileged the notion of creation ex nihilo because it gives us a way to explain bodily resurrection. God's power to create things out of nothing is the same power that creates life out of death. Regarding the question of why God created, a wide accepted answer is that the creation of alterity is what opens the space for a relationship of love. So again, when we're thinking about why God creates anything, it's in order to love. Let's think about it like this. If God loves, she feels for the suffering of her creatures, to the point that she might wish the very possibility of suffering had never been created in the first place. God herself may wonder, why did I give birth? Why did I go through the pain? Was it really my wish that I become a mother? Think about the problems that as humans we have created. Poverty, pollution, war, human trafficking, animal testing. What cosmic plan could possibly make up for the suffering and anguish that accompanies the experience of simply being alive? Who would be such a coward as to justify a cosmic purpose and make the declaration to its victims? Can any heaven compensate for the atrocities suffered throughout generations and even now? Imagine God existing in a time prior to creation. What could she be doing? Was she already pregnant with creation? Was she thinking about her creation? Was thinking even a possibility before God's coming into and through cosmic matter? The gender of God is a subject that has received a lot of discussion in more recent times. While I personally believe that any notion of God supersedes human gender, I also like to believe the personhood of God encompasses not only that of male and female, father and mother, but also non-binary forms of gender that have not been represented in our more traditional vernaculars. Distracting as it may be for some to refer to God as anything other than the male gender, choosing any particular value from within a limited binary set, such as she or he, has ultimately given certain members of societies the impetus to put one of those values, he, over the other, she, and doing so under the guise of reflecting a divine relationship here on earth. Simply put, if you want to express God's sovereignty while maintaining the personal intimacy described by the gospel writers, Paul, early church leaders, and Luther, you must express God's power to bridge that gap, and this includes the power to create as only as she can. We can just as easily extend this thinking to include, but not limit it to, the other non-conventional expressions, such as sie and the singular they. When I think about a time prior to creation, I like to imagine that God was entertained with her own thoughts, having no need for a garden with animals, no need for something called light, nor for separation between that light and darkness. I see a God that is everything at once through her thoughts, everything except a creator, for there is no creation yet. But how could God become something God was not already? She must have been creating in some way. She must have been creating, at the very least, thoughts, creative thoughts, thoughts of creation. Some of them being so complex and entangled within each other that they started creating molecules out of themselves and even cells. Maybe God was simply curious to see what would unfold of that unplanned, life-giving thought she once had. In this way, creation can be seen as an accident of curiosity. Maybe the pleasure generated by the act of creation was so overwhelming that even God was unable to think about stopping. After all, isn't there nothing more pleasurable than love? As God saw her child growing inside of her, she fed it with her best nutrients and imagined all the possible futures of the yet-to-be-born universe. Words of divinity made it official. Let there be light, and there was light. God appreciated what she had done. She enjoyed the company. She felt love for all the children that grew out of her. She was proud of them and eager to see their development in time, for that is how creation had to be constrained in order to happen. It had to exist in time, and as such, never completely revealed, not even entirely to God. Luther avoids the question of what God was doing before creation. About what human reason cannot know, we should rather stay silent. But humans can learn something of God through her creation. In this explanation of what it means to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," Luther affirms that God provides us with everything that is necessary for the continuation of our lives: food, drink, clothing, and also friends and societies. Why is it that some people are left without food or clothing? That happens not because of God, but because of humans, who have the unhelpful ability to not reflect God's love in their dwellings in the world. As Luther thought that humans are sinful, no matter what, so that any offer of salvation must be completely independent from what humans can offer. Now, let's take a look at the creation narratives. The creation narratives of Genesis 1, likely written under Babylonian rule, and of Genesis 2 through 3, supposedly older, composed under Solomon's rule, have been used at many points in history for ill-intentioned purposes. They have been used to justify colonization and exploitation of natural resources, to affirm the dominion of God's obeying peoples over other nations, and to proclaim the inferiority of women within a hierarchical conception of reality that posits that white male as the highest point of creation. In our study of Genesis, it's important to be aware of the violence that has accompanied the Christian reading of the book, so that we do not participate in its perpetuation, but rather allow the liberating spirit that lives through the words written by a people under captivity to still speak to us today. I look forward to the questions and themes that you would like to discuss as we interact the forum. For now, let me highlight 3 topics that have been of special interest lately for theologians working on a theology of creation: climate justice, gender equality, and the relation between religion and science. You can find very good contributions to all these topics in the LWF booklet, Creation, Not for Sale. The topic of climate justice draws our attention to the various ways humans have not been taking care of creation. The topic is related to the question of social justice as well as vulnerable groups. The poor, the migrant, children, the elderly, as well as other vulnerable species, are the most exposed to the harmful consequences of climate change. Genesis 1 verse 28 states that humans were told to subdue the world and have dominion over the earth. If we think of the biblical text as an expression not only of forms of eternal, divine wisdom, but also of modes of being human in time, which are always circumstantial and less than perfect, we may draw the conclusion that the verse expresses that which humans saw to be the case. They did not exert dominion over creation, and, as dinosaurs could just as well have concluded in their era if they had written narratives of creation, humans posited themselves as not only authorized but as expected to exert dominion over the rest of creation. God has given us the capacity to become aware of our harmful presence, and with such awareness comes the responsibility to change our ways as to become a healing, creative, life-oriented presence on earth. The orientation from the proper relationship with which the rest of creation is offered by Genesis itself. Genesis 2, verse 15, speaks of cultivating and keeping the earth. The book of Genesis affirms that the universe was created by the divine will for life-giving relationships. God thus desires a life-sustaining communion with this creation. This affirmation contradicts the conception of God as being self-sufficient and absent from creation, controlling it from outside or above. God has an intimate relationship with all of creation and is present in creation. In the liturgy, we praise God with the words of the prophet Isaiah. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. That's in Isaiah 6, verse 3. Isaiah declares that God's presence fills the whole earth, which is God's sanctuary. Martin Luther wrote how God is present in, with, and under all things. God is substantially present everywhere, in and through all creatures, in all their parts and places, so that the world is full of God, and he fills all, but without his being encompassed and surrounded by it. How can reason tolerate it that the divine majesty is so small that it can be substantially present in a grain, on a grain, through a grain, within and without? His own divine essence can be in all creatures collectively and in each one individually more profoundly, more intimately, more present than the creature is in itself. Yet it can be encompassed nowhere and by no one. God is thus the source of all being, rather than the observer who intervenes from outside. God's incarnation in Jesus shows God's intimate relationship with creation. Jesus tells his disciples to go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. Mark 16, verse 15. The good news of God's reconciling and life-giving communion is thus not meant only for human beings. The new creation, grounded in the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ, encompasses all of creation. The question of gender relationships occurs later in Genesis 3, where men's dominion over women is being affirmed. Here again, we see the justification of a human system that finds itself already in place, the system of patriarchy. Genesis 3, verse 16 states that men will rule over women. Genesis 1 offers us an alternative reading, inasmuch as the woman is not created after the man, but both are created equally in the image of God. As humans, we all share a common place of origin, the uterus. As a Garden of Eden, the uterus is experienced as a place of love and care, but it can also be scary and traumatizing to find oneself completely vulnerable to the knowledge and power of creation of somebody external to ourselves. Out of fear, humans have rebelled against the bodies that generated them. And instead of welcoming the uterus as a space of creation and freedom, they transformed it into a burden, a law that kills. Women were told that it is their function to generate children, and that the entirety of their being is defined by such a function. Observing the ways humans' reproductive organs are arranged, men and women were told to be essentially different, an assumption that had been nothing more than an excuse to exclude women from positions of leadership. This is the mistake that needs to be urgently corrected, and Luther himself can offer us some help in that. In his lectures on Genesis, he writes, Adam and Eve's partnership involves not only their means, but children, food, bed, and dwelling. Their purposes, too, are the same. The result is that the husband differs from the wife in no other respect than sex. Otherwise, the woman is altogether a man." End quote. Differentiation between male and female, according to Luther, is a result of the fall. If the woman had not been deceived by the serpent and had not sinned, she would have been the equal of Adam in all respects. For the punishment that she is now subjected to the man was imposed on her after sin and because of sin. As a result, she has been deprived of the ability of administering the affairs that are outside the home and that concern the state. By now we know the multitude of cultures and their infinite ways of constructing gender identities to say that the idea of men and women to which social spaces they belong or not are very relative. Humans are allowed the creative freedom to decide with which gender they identify beyond a traditional binary heteronormative conception of gender. And Luther, although he will never be an LGBT model for anyone, still allows us to feel inspired by his gender-free paradise. The last topic that I would like to mention is that of the relation of religion and sciences. From the sciences, we learn so many fascinating things about the way organisms interact and how their lives develop from within one another. Think, for instance, about the creative mystery entailed by the transformation of an egg into a bird. Think about the bird and its courage in opening its wings for its first flight. The more we learn about the world that surrounds us, the more we open ourselves to the mysteries of God's creations as it continues to take place all around us. At the same time, scientists have not only found cures for diseases, but also developed pesticides and other chemicals harmful to human beings and the environment. An ethical orientation that chooses life over profit is crucial if we are to embrace Luther's vision of deep incarnation, as Barbara Rossing writes, which calls us to care for the earth and all its communities of life. We'll discuss these topics in more detail in the forum. You are welcome to share this with the group questions, ideas, remarks. I hope that you are all excited to learn from one another and that we can have an enriching experience through our dialogues in this course. See you in the forum.